Whoosh.
Yes. Whoosh!
Forspoken is a very unique, I want to say, action RPG developed by Luminous Productions. The game is in fact a co-production between Japan and America, with a script, oh boy, a script written by the American contributors who seem to be anything but luminous. A review copy was provided by Square Enix, who obnoxiously insist on reminding the audience of this fact every 20 minutes or so. I think that will about cover it for this video, which won't make it quite that far. Of course, in all seriousness, I am thankful for the opportunity to see if Forspoken was actually as forgettable as a lot of people said it was, or to see if it had something interesting to show for and to speak for itself. The game definitely has a lot to say, thanks to its even more obnoxiously snarky characters that feel the need to suck all of the oxygen out of the open world by constantly quipping stupid shit to us. I will be using profanity a bit more than usual in this video because that attitude fits the game's style quite well. My initial perception toward Forspoken, just based on promotional material, is that they were going to shoehorn some kind of generic, algorithmic Marvel-inspired protagonist to sell the game off of. That is kind of the consensus about the main character, Frey, not the most imaginative name for a character. I much prefer the homonym Freya, the NPC from God of War. Anyway, Frey turned out to be, in all honesty, a much more likable character than I thought she would be, which I guess is saying something. I had anticipated the main character to have a cardboard personality, just a female-skinned protagonist for the sake of it. In actuality, Forspoken's Frey does have some character and ever so slightly a bit of charm that reminds me of Will Smith's character from Hancock back in the day. She's even got the hobo beanie outfit to start the game with. Frey's backstory is somewhat promising. She's an orphaned troublemaker who can't get right, living destitute in the Big Apple, with nothing much to lose and no real perspective on life. Of course, New York is a boring setting, so Frey is whisked away into a faraway land to be given some reluctant responsibility in the hopes of redeeming herself. Frey is an unserious shit-talker for most of the game's plot. It's easy to see how this would quickly turn players off. But I personally like this approach to writing the main character because although it doesn't provide much depth, it's more entertaining than the snooze-fest supporting cast and their very mundane, over-the-top British accents, which the game even makes fun of in one funny sequence.
I don't sound like that.
You absolutely sound like that.
No, you absolutely sound like that. Yeah, see? Two can play at that game.
You're fucking stupid.
Interestingly enough, the young actress who plays Frey is even British herself, but she does a good job inflecting an American accent and giving some life into an otherwise lifeless script. There's not much to speak of about the supporting characters or the predictable narrative, but thankfully it runs a little under 15 hours or so for the main questline, at which point you will have to decide whether or not you want to partake in the open world fetch quest to unlock the rest of your skills. You do get one boring sidekick named Cuff, who is literally nothing more than an invisible voice to whom Frey directs her trash talk to every 30 seconds or so when wandering the open world. Talking sidekicks are totally nothing new in games. Plenty of good games have some kind of comic relief machine, but I think video games should be past the point of this type of lazy writing that crosses over the border of inconvenient into insufferable territory. Why they felt the need to pad so much of the empty exploration with bullshit banter is beyond me. Pairing the main character with some talking one-liner generator to try and lessen the dulling experience actually contributes to more headaches than if they just let you free roam in peace. It's a dumb thing for me to say, But Elden Ring is a game with a silent protagonist that feels exponentially more immersive than Forspoken with its unsolicited quips. It doesn't constitute immersion, and it doesn't make me laugh much at all. It just makes you want to mute the game half the time, which is no joke, an option the developers included in the accessibility options. Forspoken is a much better game when you can tell these two to just shut the fuck up.
Gee, thanks for stating the obvious.
Have to be the one to start the conversation?
Not at all. Feel free to shut the fuck up. Forever.
I'm speechless.
You know it is truly horrendous when even the characters are telling each other to shut the fuck up. In short, Frey's best qualities are her uninhibited potty mouth, which is occasionally cute, and her actual combat techniques, which we'll get to soon. Everything else about the writing is dog shit. The aggressively mediocre writing style of Forspoken seriously reminds me of the early days of my amateur screenwriting, where I would fill up entire pages with dialogue that was neither very stylish or substantive. Here in Forspoken, the writers do what is probably my biggest writing pet peeve, which is they include mind-numbing lines of dialogue which are intended to be self-inserts that attempt to make the game itself seem better than it is. This is nothing more than ammunition for me to use against it, and I always look out for this type of shit when I'm reading the dialogue in games or films as a viewer.
Actually busy. Like what we're doing is fun.
Forgive me for trying to lighten the mood.
Make it sound like what we're doing is fun. It's a bummer and a head scratcher because one of the consultants is a woman by the name of Amy Hennig, someone I very much admire, but apparently the industry hates because she went from making Uncharted games to working on Forspoken. I believe the main shortcoming with Forspoken is this fact. The actual game portion of Forspoken is tolerable and functional. That part was made by the Japanese developers, who will get more shit for this game than they rightfully deserve. The part of Forspoken that stinks was handled by the English-speaking writers, who couldn't sound much worse in English, so I hope they sound a little more coherent in the Japanese dub. Playing the game on mute, when you're just zipping around the open world, feels rather easygoing, if not mindless, and I don't have a problem with that aspect. The land of Athia, in my opinion, one of the many horrible names used in Forspoken, is not the most detailed or colorful open world, but it certainly is grand, getting compared to the map size of Elden Ring, but of course, not in terms of interesting things to do. Athia has 5 distinct biomes that are each the size of a small city and some other open world games. Visually, the game actually looks quite nice in some areas, not nearly as bad as the game was getting accused of being by the Twitter fanboys who love to start arguments about which console you should play. One complaint I have, though, is how the game's lighting quality takes a nosedive in certain places, like these examples where you open the door to go back outside, and the game looks almost stunning, but then the color fades and it looks dead. The entire game isn't like this, but it is a curious case of what could have been if maybe the size of the game was toned down a bit to focus more on the art style that does have something to offer in the smaller picture. All in all, the draw distances are good, and the parkour system is something I will give credit to, because there are a lot of open world games that are even more tedious than Forspoken can be, because they lack the ability to simply move at the speed you want to move. And I think this is maybe the reason for the game being so large, because they have implemented a system in which they want you to run, jump, fly, and vault across obstacles, and feel free while you're doing it. In this sense, Forspoken does make good use of its space for traversal, if only the activities within weren't largely copy and pasted. I would have said beforehand that Forspoken was poorly optimized at a size of roughly 80 gigabytes on the PlayStation 5. However, these load times are possibly the fastest I've ever seen in a game. They're instant. You can travel to virtually any point across this massive open world map, and you'll wind up on the spot with no delay. This feature and functionality makes God of War Ragnarok look like a total joke. I had a few game crashes, but other than that, Forspoken has a smooth performance even when we play it in graphic mode. Another aspect of Forspoken that I have to praise is the combat. Of course, one of the most important components of any video game. I found myself frequently comparing Forspoken to last year's Ghostwire Tokyo, a game with very similar elemental-focused spells that felt underwhelming in that game. Here in Forspoken, you have a huge variety of magic abilities to choose from, many that carry a feeling of weight and spectacle. The trouble with this is lazy, repeated enemy design that doesn't much vary in movesets or attack patterns, and the fact that the vast majority of these spells are locked behind in-game progression that most players will miss unless they are completionists. I myself am, and I tolerated Forspoken long enough to platinum this game and unlock all of the equipment upgrades and the 100 or so spells, which are really more like 50, really closer to around 50 unique spells by my count, when you ignore the upgrades to distinct attacks. This is honestly an impressive combat arsenal, just lacking a more dynamic combat system, or else it could have been even called great. I at times felt like I was playing a hack and slash game with how fluid and mobile the character can get. God of War Ragnarok combat had weight, but often because of how spongy the enemies were, it got a little bit boring. There's a nice flow at times to the combat here because of the ability to zip around to various targets. The bosses get to be a bit tanky, but at least they offer you a chance to test out some of your moves on. Despite the amount of attacks on offer, the ability to switch attacks on the fly, there are not great opportunities for being able to combine the attacks in battle. For example, each element strikes a particular weakness towards some enemy in the game, but enemies don't seem to revolve weaknesses as much as they could if, say, encounters were more diverse and optimized for using strategy. In most situations, you can just go into a big fight and spam whatever attack you want and get the job done just fine. You can occasionally use support spells, such as Bind, to keep enemies frozen and then switch to the element that you think will do big damage, but they could have done more to make encounters feel like a puzzle that needs solving rather than the generic gallery cleanup that it often does. The boss fights, in my opinion, are pretty unique, and they do come with the need for strategizing and patience, not just for the somewhat tanky HP pool they maintain, but because they do have some patterns that you have to memorize and manage. I'm starting to use a new calculator when deciding if a game is worth $60, or in this case, $70 price tag. The equation I use is $1 equals 1 hour. I platinumed Forspoken in about 61 hours, so I guess it's worth it if that's what you're going for. I'm usually generous when reviewing games, but I'm getting back to a tougher stance because that's what video games need. I'm tired of everyone labeling every game they play to be a masterpiece, and on the flip side, you have idiots that get a hold of Metacritic to bomb Forspoken into a 3 out of 10 user score. For my first 10 hours of Forspoken, I gave no fucks, to paraphrase the main character. I sensed that a lot of others didn't much care either, which might explain the terrible user score. Or perhaps people just want to steal someone else's opinion because they are more abundant and accessible than coming up with an intelligent critique like the ones I always try to iron out. At least I made a proper review instead of a clown like Video Game Donkey, whose Forspoken review contained simply 1 second of actual Forspoken footage before he went on a tantrum playing Spider-Man 2 on the PlayStation 2. And in truth, there is some validity to this style of satire. But the thing with Forspoken and games like it is that the more you play, sometimes you actually end up liking the game, or at least not loathing it like I did initially. Being able to say Square Enix gave me the game for free was going to be the nicest thing I said about the game, or so I thought. Forspoken certainly has forgettable moments, and I jokingly refer to the game as broken, which is what the curse is called in the game itself. But truthfully, Forspoken is a video game underneath the fluff that the writers injected in the bloated open world that was designed for free-running parkour. I have arrived at a similar consensus to some of my colleagues, albeit for different reasons. I almost liked the main character, who looked uninteresting in pre-release material, but turned out to be a little less generic than I thought, only because she has a decent actress that happens to be bogged down by atrocious dialogue. Frey at least sounds normal as opposed to the robotic, cartoony voice acting in British. It's still easier for me to say what Forspoken does right instead of everything that makes me cringe. So here I'm going to actually break down the score that I gave Forspoken and why I feel it deserves it. At best, Forspoken is probably somewhere around a 7 for the gameplay, and at worst a 3 for the bad writing. So altogether that comes to a middle of the road score of a 5 out of 10. Because most players will either really dislike the game and find it hard to continue past the main missions and shit dialogue, or they will persevere to collect the side content and wind up thinking Forspoken was a slightly above average open world collectathon. Forspoken offers an important lesson about how to properly cultivate interest, engagement, and atmosphere in a video game, all of which depend on getting us to buy into and care for the premise of the story and characters. Let Forspoken be a lesson that sometimes the best way to present a story, especially in a video game, is to just shut the fuck up and show, not tell.
Fuck that thing, fuck that, fuck everything about this place.
Return that.
Child, let go? What the fuck are you talking about?
No!